What's up, everyone? It is Fido from Self-Taught Hustle, back at it again. And today I will be showing you guys how to execute a GET request to an external API in order to get data returned to our core application here and here on the browser, right? So the core, what we'll be doing is that we will be going to this endpoint, this / post endpoint, utilizing a GET request, right? And then we'll see the endpoint here, and collecting this data that you see in front of you via the GET request, right? And just to give you guys a little bit more depth here, this is the JSON placeholder API, and this endpoint, this / post endpoint is essentially simulating a set of data that's being referenced from a second system. And what we'll be doing, as I said, is we'll be using a GET request to access this data, return it to our main application here, and then log it out on to the console, right? If you need to get an understanding of what an API is and what request methods are, go ahead and look at the first two videos in this series. I will leave a link for those in the description box below. All right, so without further ado, we will get started here. So for the setup today, all you need is a basic index.html file, right? You can name it whatever you want. I would recommend that extension is a .html. And then we will just be doing a pair of script tags here, and we will be writing the JavaScript right on the markup itself, right? So let's go and get this data. So the first thing that we want to do is that we want to identify where on the network we want to go and collect the data, right? And in our instance, that'll be this URL here, this https / JSON placeholder.typecode.com, right? And we're going to do let URL, right? So we're going to set up a variable, and then we're going to copy this guy here, right? And we're going to place that URL into a string data type like that. And just so you know, what you see in front of you here, when you see this, these brackets that kind of look like object literals in JavaScript, this is a JSON object, right? And a really simple way of thinking about this is that when you communicate with an API, a JSON object is a way that the data is transported between your system, the API, and then the second system, right? So this is just a way for the data to be transported across the network. So if you guys ever run into this, just know, oh, look, this is data that is meant to be sent across the network, either received or sent, right? So the first thing that we did, and I'll open this up a little bit, is that we defined where we want to go get that data from, right? Then the next thing that we want to do is that we want to define the method itself within an object literal in JavaScript set to a variable of options, right? And what we're going to do here is that we're going to define the method via a property by the name of method, right? And then we are going to add a value here of get, right? So all that means is that we specified that we want to go and get the data at this URL endpoint, right? And the way that we functionally execute that process is via a fetch function in JavaScript, right? And what fetch is that it is a layer in JavaScript. Well, what it is tangibly, as you see it in front of you, is that it's a global function. So you're able to see it, or you're able to use it anywhere throughout your code, is what that means. And then the second part is that it is a abstraction, right? So it's a function that allows us to execute requests across a network with very, very simple setup to do so, right? So just as a refresher, we want to get data back. So what we're going to put into this function is two parameters that it takes. The first is the URL, which is the endpoint, right? This post endpoint. And then the second is going to be the method that we want to execute, which is contained in this object literal. And we're going to call it options as well, right? Because we want to pass this variable into the function, right? So now we've instructed our code to go out and get the data. And what we want to do is that we want to validate whether or not our request, right? Our request method was accepted via the JSON placeholder API, right? So what we're doing here is that we're effectively pinging the API, and we want to get literal feedback to understand whether or not we successfully connected or communicated with that API. And the way that we do that is using the .then operator here with the then function, right? And then here we are going to pass in a parameter titled response and use the fat arrow syntax for an anonymous function in JavaScript, right? And this, as you can see here in the IntelliSense, it's just another way to write a function without a name, right? It just looks cooler, it's a little bit simpler. And in this response, what we're going to do is that we're going to catch the response, and then we are going to specify that we are looking for the JSON object, right? We're going to go ahead and save that. And then we're going to log this response out to the console just to validate whether or not we successfully pinged the API, right? See here. So we'll go over here to our application, and here you go. And it looks like it was a success because we see that the promise was fulfilled, right? And what this really means is that it was just kind of waiting. This promise is just really a way to define that you sent out a request and that it was waiting. When the promise is fulfilled, is essentially saying, hey, look, we sent out a request and we got a response back, right? And that's illustrated here via this line. And then specifying the JSON object, we could see that we actually have the data already here in our console, which is awesome. But the thing is that we don't want all this extra junk in there. We just want to get the raw data itself onto the console. And that's what I will be showing you guys how to do next, right? So the good thing is that we got a successful response back, right? The next thing that we're going to do is that we are going to pull that data out of all of the stuff that you saw here via another operator, another dot operator, and another then function, right? And then we are going to write data. I've seen this written as JSON as well. It doesn't really matter what you write it as, just as long as it makes sense when you read it. And in that data, we are going to console log it out to our console here, right? Now, the thing is that these two then functions work in conjunction with one another, right? In particular, this second then function is dependent on what happens here in this first dot then function, right? So if we embed this response.json function here, what we're really doing is that within a console log, we're making it unaccessible to the second dot then function. So what we're going to want to do is actually just chop that out, right? We'll hit save. And now when you come over here, you can see all of the raw data that we returned, right? So you have it all here, right? And now you don't have all that extra junk. You've identified that it's an array, right, with 100 objects inside of it, or 100 items really, right? And it's this stuff here, right? So this was somewhere out on the internet. We went and identified that that's where we wanted to go and get. We specified the method literally get in this instance via an object literal set to a variable's to the options variable. Then we pass the URL variable and then the options variable into the fetch function, effectively saying, hey, go and get the data that's set in this place in the network, right? Then we we validated the feedback from the API, right? Did we successfully access the API? Did we fail to access to the API? Well, we passed it, right? Or we passed that validation, I should say. And then once we got the acceptance from the API, we then specified that we're looking for the JSON object. Then we pulled the data out and logged it out to the console here in our application, right? So yeah, that is how you execute a GET request using the fetch function in JavaScript. Really simple. This process used to be a lot more complicated back in the day. But if you are ever in a situation where you have to pop out a quick request programmatically out to an API, fetch is an excellent option to get things running up nice and fast, right? So yeah, if you guys have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. I appreciate you, and I will see you next time.